I'm Roberta Glass, and you're listening to my True Crime Report. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Allison Mack and her Life After NXIVM podcast, which is being produced by the CBC. And it's a long multi-parter. And it's the first that we've really heard from Allison Mack since her sentencing hearing. She's gotten married. She's been in classes. She wants to now become a social worker. So she's taking, advanced degree classes to become a social worker. Hello, Blue River. Hello, Maestro. Thanks to everybody hello, Melanie. So I wanted to just finish up about it. Talking about it, and I think it's Allison Mack has been a really uncomfortable figure for those of us like myself who covered NXIVM from the courtroom, from the early hearings on, when Allison Mack, Lauren Salzman, let me see if I can show you guys, get up the whole list of defendants so you can see Kathy Russell, Claire Bronfman, Nancy Salzman all arrived in court, and they attended these hearings. The vibe was from them that they had no idea or didn't care how serious the charges were against them. And you can hear Allison Mack in the podcast talking about how she was sure that it would be worked out at any minute, that this was just some kind of misunderstanding. And she was sure, she talks about the conversations with her lawyers. She was sure that everything that she did in NXIVM was legal, and they assured her that it wasn't legal. And those are some of the most fascinating parts, compelling, certainly, parts of this podcast, where she's talking about her lawyers being like, yeah, no, that's illegal. She's like, well, I just told them to seduce Keith, and then Keith took naked pictures of them, and in very compromising positions. And they're like, yeah, that collateral. I mean, the collateral part is like such a key part of the coercion. So the idea that they would release something that would be unflattering, damaging to you or your family, should you not go through with your commitments to your master and DOS, was such a key part of the coercion and trafficking, and everything having to do with NXIVM and the cult has to do with levels of power and control over other people. Ultimately, Keith Raniere had the most power, but the way NXIVM worked, as far as teaching the curriculum, you went up and you had different sashes. So the higher up you got in NXIVM, you moved up in you got a different color sash. And Allison Mack never went as far as someone like Mark Vicente, as far as this, as in sashes, but she had incredible influence due to her role as her role, or basically as her public persona as an actress, and her former role in Smallville that made her maybe a famous person, a deep C-list, B-list famous person. I don't know, depending on how you're gonna look at it. I mean, certainly Smallville was a successful TV show and had a long run. But so here's a look at the NXIVM defendants. Keith Raniere, of course. I'm forgetting and they'd come in and they'd sort of smile and giggle and talk to each other. And there was a feeling looking at Allison Mack's lawyers, like, you got a sense looking at her lawyers, like that they didn't know what to do with her. Like, what are we going to do? We have such a severely brainwashed client. What are we going to do with this client? How are we going to defend this client? And I think that's some of the more compelling parts of this podcast, where Allison Mack talks about her proffer, where she's like, just tell me what to say. I don't know what to say. She's still so convinced that what she did was good or had good effects. And I want to talk about in this podcast what we talk about when we talk about remorse, or what we expect to hear when we're hearing from someone like Allison Mack, who was both a victim and a victimizer in this cult. It's a very uncomfortable duality that she plays in this story. So she was both worked on and groomed by Keith Raniere to take on this position as DOS slave master, especially after Pam Kafritz died, who was really the key recruiter, and how she fulfilled the role, and how she looked at her victims now. And I think that's what's really missing from this podcast, is any acknowledgement of the pain that she caused her victims. So much of this podcast is Allison Mack explaining as to why she was susceptible to NXIVM. So she brings up her past as an actress, how she was a child actress, which I think is flat out child abuse, and how she was beholden to these male directors and punished for being she talks about being punished as a young teenager, I think 12 or 13, for being overtly sexual or flirting with a male director, and how that set her up. I think what she's saying is that set her up to be a victim of Raniere, to be, as an actor, you're compliant, you say the lines, you do the things. And Allison Mack was known as an actor or an actress, whatever words you want to use, who would work very professionally and go the extra mile to please the director. And so that kind of, she's saying that held over into NXIVM, where she would go the extra mile to please Keith Raniere, who was the head of the cult. But and also, she talks about a relationship she had with a boyfriend that was very destructive and unhealthy, and that he would hurt himself and say, look what you made me do, and use those kind of manipulation tactics. And so she's right from this unhealthy relationship straight into NXIVM. So, but when it comes to real reflection on how she treated other women and why she treated, why she felt it was okay, you always come up to the same roadblock with Allison Mack. Like, I thought it would help them. I thought it was doing good. And if I was turned off by what I was seeing, either with the messages that I saw Keith Raniere writing other women, or any of the other abusive things that I saw at NXIVM, I always kind of wrote it off in my head that Keith Raniere would somehow make it right, that his intentions were good, that he was the most ethical person. And you have to remember that this is a cult that the curriculum was that there were no victims. So I almost called this episode like No Victims, but lots of victims left. And it seems like in this podcast, she went to her sentencing thinking that she was hoping that she would get no prison time, because she had tried to help the prosecution out. She sounds like she wasn't of much help, that she was still too brainwashed to help be of any or much help, but she tried. Whereas Nancy Salzman, who's the bottom middle here, Nancy Salzman's daughter, Lauren Salzman, who's the bottom middle here, testified and was one of the strongest witnesses for the prosecution in the case against Keith Raniere. So we're looking at all these. This is another really important thing that this podcast does, which is plays with time. So we're looking at all the defendants here. Kathy Russell, he was the bookkeeper on the top left. Keith Raniere in the middle, who was the cult leader, said he had a 240 IQ, which was actually an IQ test that one of his child victims had taken, take-home test. Nancy Salzman on the top right, who is the number 2 in NXIVM, who taught most of the curriculum, or a lot of the curriculum, is the second most established neurolinguistic programmer in the world. So neurolinguistic programming is a kind of painting portraits with words, or hypnosis using words. And bottom left is Allison Mack, middle is Lauren Salzman, and the right is, so Lauren Salzman is Nancy Salzman's daughter, and Claire Bronfman on the bottom right, the Seagram's heiress. So with her sister fled the country when it looked like charges were coming down, her sister Sarah, and has never faced any charges for her part in NXIVM. So what are we looking for when we're looking for remorse? Is some acknowledgement of your part in the story and your responsibility in the story. And Allison Mack has no problem saying that she did the thing and she did what she was accused of, and it was illegal. But it's always with the idea that, well, the punishments that I gave out, I did too. So like I did to myself too. So I took cold showers. I was in this predatory relationship with Raniere. I also was branded with a cauterizing tool and with no on my hip, in my groin area, like all of the DOS slaves were. And that because I experienced that pain, that I guess that I'm just, that my responsibility, the person really responsible is Keith Raniere, which is partially true. But where's Allison Mack's part in this? And that really never gets answered. It gets explained away. And this is something that we saw when we looked at her sentencing. And so they're hoping, she goes into her sentencing, hoping that she's going to get what eventually Lauren Salzman, who's sentenced after her, gets, which is like no prison time. And of course, that's another thing that they play with time. They basically move the time of everything so that they have in this podcast, they have Allison Mack deciding whether she's going to plead out as Keith Raniere's trial is going on. But everyone pled out before Keith Raniere's trial. Everyone but Keith Raniere pled out, meaning pled guilty, leaving only Keith Raniere to face trial. And the sentencing happened in 2020, 2021, after the pandemic. So the sentencing was vastly delayed because of the pandemic. So Allison Mack's sentencing happened before Lauren Salzman's sentencing. And in the podcast, they have Allison Mack hoping that she'll get no prison time like Lauren. But Lauren hadn't been sentenced at that point. So she had hoped that she got no prison time just for helping the government and pleading guilty, and for being both a victim and a perpetrator in the story. And Judge Garifas, who they describe him in this as coming out of central casting because he had a New York accent, I would say Judge Garifas is like no judge I've ever seen. He was the most psychologically astute, intuitive judge. There's one moment at Claire Bronfman's sentencing that I'll never forget, where Claire Bronfman was giving her speech and she started to re-victimize her victim with NXIVM techniques, and Judge Garifas picked up on it immediately and stopped her and said, "This judge isn't blind." I mean, I almost get goosebumps thinking about it now. So I don't think there's anything like from Central I mean, maybe because he had a New York accent. Is that what they're saying? I mean, he's the most, if I would call him, I would call him iconoclastic, intuitive, most amazing judge for this case and the perfect judge for this case. And I think that the sentences that he gave, I would have probably given Allison Mack a longer sentence. Besides for Allison Mack, I thought was pretty fair. And I agreed with all of it except for Mack. I thought Allison Mack should have, for her part, which was she tortured these women. So I thought she should have done more time with very little remorse. So when we go to her sentencing, here's what Allison Mack said at her sentencing. She said, "I'm sorry to those of you that I brought into NXIVM. I am sorry I ever exposed you to the nefarious and emotionally abusive schemes of a twisted man." So it's sort of like it's Keith Raniere. I'm sorry I brought you to this horrible person. But again, it's a kind of blind spot with her. What was your part? And she expresses a great deal of rage and jealousy towards women and a frustration that she can't control women as well as she can control men, especially using her sexuality. But she talks about punishments that she did to herself and how hard she was on herself and starving herself. And all that was very obvious in court, that the women were not well and were very ill and very brainwashed. But I think she still has a long ways to go to get better. And if anything, that this podcast is very premature. Because, there's something that comes along with being an actor or an actress, or I guess I'll just use the word actress. I'll stick with that. Being an actress and having this kind of power and ability to manipulate people with your put on emotions. And Allison Mack was indeed like the star of her family. And her mother talks about being terribly afraid of her own daughter, of pushing her own daughter away, to the point when they put down millions of, I think it was like some incredible amount of money, bond money for her bail, that they said, "We want you to be loyal to us and not Raniere." They were worried that she would take the bail money and be loyal to Raniere. So that's when Allison Mack moved home, and her mother was assuring her that she wasn't crazy. I'm wondering, listening to it, was that the best thing to do? Maybe tell her, and it's unclear exactly what kind of help Allison Mack got and when she got it, because through many, many years, through her sentencing, it doesn't seem like, and to now, she's still talking about all the good parts of NXIVM. So it's a little bit like talking about something that's entirely destructive, that I don't think anybody that got into NXIVM came out better than when they went in. There was so much destruction caused by this cult that I think that the good parts, whatever good you got, are really negated by the amount of destruction that it caused. But so that's Allison Mack's sentence, and that's in a broad contrast to someone like Lauren Salzman's sentencing. And let's just take a listen to, here are some of my thoughts on Lauren Salzman's sentencing. This was like an incredibly emotional sentencing hearing. I just remember coming out of this courthouse after Lauren Salzman's sentencing with my head spinning. Take a listen.
I arrived to the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse for Lauren Salzman's sentencing with a wish and many questions. How had the emaciated, disconnected, and defiant Lauren Salzman, who I observed at the early hearings, how had she turned into one of the most valuable witnesses in Keith Raniere's trial? How did she view her role in the cult that her mother, Nancy Salzman, built? And most of all, I wondered if she would serve prison time. Lauren Salzman pled guilty in a closed hearing on March 25, 2019, to 2 counts of racketeering that carried with it, by today's judges' calculations, a possible sentence of 7 to 9 years. However, I hoped she would walk out of today's hearing with nothing more than probation. I wasn't alone. Judge Garifas began today's session with a reference to the enormous amount of support Lauren had received in the letters sent to the court. Even Lauren's victims penned letters that reflected what Garifas described as, quote, an empathy you would not expect, unquote. Lauren Salzman came to court without makeup, in a cotton white shirt, light pink linen face mask, and hair pulled back in a ponytail. It was the perfect outfit to surrender yourself to custody, I thought to myself. Unlike Allison Mack, who made a grand entrance into the courthouse's larger ceremonial room, Lauren arrived quietly and largely unnoticed into the smaller courtroom, 4D. She cut a small figure on the right side of the courtroom next to her lawyer, Hector Diaz. Only 2 victim impact statements were heard. One victim, Bibi, sent a victim impact statement via audio recording. Her voice filled the courtroom. Through sobs and pauses, she recounted how excited she was to have been matched with Lauren as her NXIVM coach. She described Lauren as smart and funny and kind. However, when she wanted to leave NXIVM just days before the cult's annual retreat, Lauren became, quote, a hostage negotiator of sorts, unquote. Bibi said Lauren used gaslighting, manipulation, and lies, and what Keith Raniere had called a might is right technique to keep her from leaving. She went on to describe how Lauren groomed me to make me feel safe within the midst of a predator. Quote, she used her skills to accept me being a victim with a smile, unquote. And she ended her statement with a personal message to Lauren. Quote, I suspect you were living in fear since Keith Raniere's arrest. Today, I asked you to reflect on that feeling and reflect on where you would have been had you chosen differently, unquote. Susan Dones was in court to read her victim impact statement. Dones emphasized Lauren's personal responsibility in her crimes. Dones pointed out that Lauren had led a privileged life with plenty of non-NXIVM support to leave if she had chosen to. Quote, yes, you were only 22. Yes, you had a sexual relationship with Keith Raniere, but you kept it going for 2 decades. You had a highly paid position in NXIVM and always gave yourself the highest paid jobs. You were spoiled with a lot of money. Your lawyer said no one would have helped you leave NXIVM. You had a father who was a doctor and a stepmother, unquote. Dones went on to...
That's a thing that's really a mystery, is Lauren's father in all this. Is his feelings about the cult and his interactions with the cult, and how he supported if he supported his daughter, and how he supported his daughter getting away. But Lauren seemed to be the one who realized that even with her mother being number 2, and maybe it was because her mother was number 2 and her mother knew it was a fraud, because her mother was the first person who pled out right before the superseding indictment, which is really a key element that doesn't get talked about in the podcast. So before the serious charges came down, Nancy Salzman pled out, giving her really, instead of doing what she probably should have done, I mean, compared to Keith Raniere doing 120 years, she should have been doing decades. She did a couple years in prison. But Lauren Salzman reaching out to Allison Mack and saying, get out. Get out. And the other really compelling thing in this podcast is Lauren Salzman talking about, and this was obvious, talking about how Keith Raniere wanted them all to take the fall. And I think they especially wanted Kathy Russell, the bookkeeper, to take a fall for a lot of the financial crimes. And Kathy Russell also ended up doing no time. So the people that ended up doing no time were Lauren Salzman and Kathy Russell. But I think that Lauren Salzman's the arrest of Keith Raniere was one of the wake-up calls, but also, what Lauren Salzman gave up was motherhood. She wanted to be a mother, and by the time she got out of NXIVM, it's too late. Allison Mack, now in her 40s. This is also never talked about in this podcast. How does she feel about what she gave up now that she's married? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. What does she feel that she gave up? That, basically the best years of her life, or fertile years of her life. I don't think she would have been fertile. She's so underweight during her time in NXIVM. But to be with Keith Raniere to heal her issues. I mean, that has to be a source of regret, no?
Asked Lauren sternly. Aren't you responsible in some way for becoming a sex slave and a criminal? Tanya Hajar, representing the government, asked the judge to give Lauren a lenient sentence. Hajar remarked on Salzman's deep remorse and, quote, extraordinary contribution to the successful prosecution of the cult's leader, Keith Raniere, adding her contribution extended to the crimes Salzman had engaged in, including the harm she had caused Daniela. Hajar was referring to the immigrant she kept confined to an empty room for 2 years as punishment for having feelings for another man in the cult that wasn't Keith Raniere. Quote, she was able to give us information of crimes we weren't even aware of, extending to the criminal enterprise and Keith Raniere's criminal conduct over decades. Hector Diaz, Salzman's lawyer.
So Lauren Salzman was key in some of the charges that came out against Raniere. And you look at that tape, that tape of I played it yesterday, of the Keith Raniere and Allison Mack deciding how they're going to do this branding ceremony with these DOS devotees. And you can hear him talking about how he wants to make it sound like it's consensual, and he's obviously thinking about the law and getting away with this. And if they ask to be branded, maybe that will go further to being consensual. And you have to remember that Keith Raniere's defense during his trial was that NXIVM, that he had good intentions, that NXIVM did good, help people, and it was a community and a sorority. And those are all the things that they emphasized in one of the co-podcaster, Vanessa Grigoriadis's New York Times Magazine piece. And Vanessa Grigoriadis became a mouthpiece for those exact talking points, that NXIVM did good, that it was a really tight group of women, really smart group of women, that the women were really running things. And it wasn't a coercively controlled stable of women for Keith Raniere to use and abuse, which I think is more the reality of it. So this gets into what Lauren Salzman has to say, and I almost get, again, it's a goosebumpy moment thinking about Lauren Salzman's statement to the court. Take a listen.
Lawyer pleaded for leniency.
It's not what you would expect.
As well, emphasizing her redeeming conduct, her ability to admit her wrongs and take action to correct her wrongs. He said she committed criminal acts against those she called her friends. Diaz went on to highlight Lauren's willingness to correct her wrongs by pleading guilty, supplying the government with all she knew about the criminal actions of the cult, and testifying against Keith Raniere. Diaz pointed to the changes Lauren had made in her life since she had been arrested. She had gone to school to learn how to be a dog groomer, and she is now working grooming dogs with health issues. She had also sought out psychiatric help, working first with a psychiatrist and now with a therapist who specializes in people who have left cults. Diaz also pointed to the fact that this is the first time in Lauren's adult life that she can see a future not dictated by her mother or Keith Raniere. When Lauren Salzman stood up to give her statement to the court, I didn't know what to expect. She had sat through most of the proceedings with rounded shoulders, chest caved inward, catching her tears with a tissue at the corner of her eyes. This is her statement from my notes. It is not complete, but I think it's important for you to hear Lauren in her own words. I want to thank Susan and Bibi and all the victims. I think they are very brave. I know how hard it is to stand before the world and say those things. I hear what you are saying, and I know it's true. Every day I think about what I could have done differently. I live with the fact I hurt the ones I loved, and that's something I never wanted to do. On the day I was arrested and early on in home confinement, I didn't understand the charges against me. All I could feel was incredible relief. I had been taken out of a situation that had become a nightmare. Home confinement allowed me to see the truth about what I had done. I can't take that back. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't wish I could. I harmed Daniela, someone who came to better herself. I failed her and I failed myself. These things that happened should have never have happened. I couldn't live with myself if the truth that I lived with didn't come out. I feel incredible sorrow and incredible gratitude. I know that may be hard to understand. The way this whole thing has transpired has saved my life. Judge Garifas let the court sit in silence for a moment before he said, quote, "This case has exposed the rawest kind of manipulation and taking advantage of human frailty. The violence imposed on the victims in this case was silent and secretive and manipulative. The kind of violence so difficult to expose and to punish." Then the judge asked the most important unanswered question in the NXIVM story. How did this go on for so long in Albany, New York, even after it was exposed, even after the federal and state?
Right. So this is a really good question. So Judge Garifas is asking how did this go on for so long? And you have to remember that Forbes magazine was exposing NXIVM in 2003. And had Allison Mack done her research before she had joined NXIVM and found this Forbes article, maybe she wouldn't have been so quick to join it. I'm not blaming her. I'm just saying that the information was out there. There was critical information out about NXIVM. And there's definitely a, how do I put this? An impulse in Allison Mack to blame Kristen Kruk, who was her co-star in Smallville, for introducing her to Keith Raniere. But I mean, the introduction can be made, and we'll look at that introduction in a second. But I mean, this is vastly different, a different kind of message, and you can see why Lauren Salzman got no prison time. She was very helpful to the prosecution. She was very aware of that her actions, not Keith Raniere's, her actions had caused the suffering of others, and empathetic to the suffering of others. And those are things that I find missing in Allison Mack's podcast. There's a lot of empathy for herself, a lot of awareness of Keith Raniere and his evil doing, but as to beyond thinking that she was doing good or thinking that she was helping people, exactly, there is kind of like a block. Like, I thought he was good. I thought he was ethical. But, you know, she was living in Albany, seeing all this destruction, seeing all this cruelty, seeing people getting weaker and smaller and looking ill, and including herself. And she talks about keeping up all her NXIVM rituals at home, in home confinement, with an ankle bracelet on her leg. And so is it a failure of her mother to step in and say no? Because, you know, Allison Mack talks about this little dictator and this need to run things. We'll talk about that in a second. And I think that was she's still, so she a need to be admired, a need for attention, a need to have power and control over others, and a need to run things. And that hasn't seemed to been really resolved, which is why I worry that she's still dangerous. So just so you know, so I am streaming both on YouTube, and because now we have the ability. So for those who want to watch this on like a phone, it's like in phone format and it's in wide format. So if you're wondering why there's two streams going, that's why it's going. So people who want to watch it in phone format can watch it in phone format, and people can watch it in wide format. But you can also see, for Allison Mack's defense, Keith Raniere certainly worked harder on Allison Mack than anyone else. Here's their first meeting in volleyball where she asked him a question. Let's take a look at it.
Is that important to you?
Yes.
Why?
Why is that important to me? Because it's, because I think it's, because so much of who I am is wrapped up in art.
Give me an example. I guess I'm not.
When I go to see a film or a piece of artwork, or something happens to me, I'm so excited. And one blissful, joyful.
You know, you can practice generating an extreme feeling of joy over anything. There are methods that we have, especially in 2C, that go through this. It's one of our intensives. What's it called now? Civilization? Civilization? I mean, what if artistic endeavors were really bogus? What if art was just an excuse for those who couldn't do it?
And it is sometimes.
The most excitement that you've ever felt is yours to have all the time. Independent.
So you can see that Keith Raniere is using neurolinguistic programming. He's punching his words, joy, basically trying to hypnotize her. And when people ask, like, well, why did Keith Raniere, this kind of schlubby looking guy, how did he gain all this influence? One, he had the props of Claire Bronfman's money behind him. So he flew private. The Dalai Lama was paid $1 or $2 million, depending on who's reporting, to promote Keith Raniere and his teachings. He had really talented filmmakers behind him making propaganda for him, like Mark Vicente. And it's also the other people in the group. He attracted really smart, upwardly mobile people. And so, you know, often it's not the cult leader that's the attraction, it's the community, it's the people most like you that can bring you into a cult. But here you can see Keith Raniere, has a question for him, and she's going to talk to him about art, ask him questions about art and making art, because Keith Raniere has the props of being the smartest man in the world.
Of art. The bad news is you sort of have to divorce yourself from the thought that comes from the art. If you feel that art is necessary for that, that's almost a self-condemnation. Why is this emotion?
Hi.
It's okay. She comes in clutch.
I know, right? I should be used to this place.
So now Keith Raniere knows he's got her. I mean, this is how he did it, though. He listened to women and he studied them and he profiled them, but the depths of his cruelty cannot be understated. And that's something that really came into focus in the trial, how absolutely cruel he was and sadistic. And every day, you know, Danny, when she was locked in a room for 2 years, every day her tooth rotted out in the back of her mouth. She asked every day to get out. She drew cartoons. She begged Keith Raniere. She promised to be better. And every day the answer was no. I mean, and the best day of her life was when she says in that room is when she got out and went to get a root canal for her tooth rotting out in the back of her mouth. So, I mean, that's just some of it. But, you know, Allison Mack's husband talks about how this wasn't like Ghislaine Maxwell and it wasn't deviant. The things Allison Mack it was very deviant, and they were ordering things that would be considered the most deviant in terms of what you can do sexually. You know, they were ordering cages and other things for these NXIVM women. So this would have, had this not been stopped, I mean, where this would have gone had this not been stopped is a really good question. So as far as I'm concerned, I think NXIVM was much worse than in some ways than Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein.
Because it's pointing at something I've never thought about. And a part of me is kind of freaked out about accepting this. I'm used to that self-condemnation. I'm comfortable with that. If I let go of that belief, that it's not the art that's giving me this feeling, it's me that's giving me this feeling, then I have to trust that I will be capable of giving myself that feeling. And I don't necessarily trust that right now. And so that's scary, because I want that feeling. Will you give me an EM? Not right now, but at some point.
I'll speak. I normally don't give people EMs.
I don't know the protocol because I'm just popping my cherry. So.
Oh my.
So to speak.
I turn a little red. But I mean, to some degree, we did a little bit hard. So.
Yeah, I felt that. Thank you.
So when he's talking about EMs, he's talking about the NXIVM tech, which is kind of a ripoff of Scientology without the cans, exploration of meaning. So why do you have the associations you have with the feelings and or attitudes you have towards things? Yeah,
That was really,
it's hard to sit through, isn't it?
really well. Do I hug and I kiss.
Good voice.
Thank you, me too.
So he made her wait for an hour to ask this question, which is, you know, very much in the Raniere style, very much about, you know, having power and control over people. And then Allison Mack, when she was running the female empowerment part of NXIVM called Jeunesse, here's how she sold it. Take a listen.
For Jeunesse, I think, is the most gratifying thing that I've ever done.
So Audrey, some of Audrey brings up a good point. Thank you, Audrey. This is really important to talk about. So Maxwell got minors, though, and I don't know what is worse. True. But many of Keith Raniere's crimes have to do with minors and sexual predation of minors and images of minors. And he was openly talking about it being, this is one of the moments in court that I remember, listening to Keith Raniere spout off about his ideas about decriminalizing, having to do with the age of consent and basically making excuse for those that prey on minors. And all the NXIVM devotees just kind of like I would have run out of there screaming. They all were like, "Oh, thank you for sharing your vast wisdom, Vanguard," which is what he was called in NXIVM. So it is a good. So there was that aspect too in NXIVM. Not often talked about. Thank you, Audrey.
It's the most challenging thing I've ever done because it consists of working with a group of people in a way that is totally interdependent, meaning we're all working together and no one is ever punished and no one is ever...
Yeah, a lot of this, Audrey, has gotten like kind of whitewashed by The Vow. So The Vow is the HBO documentary, which kind of takes a look at Wild Wild Country, where they look at these cults and they try to argue for the good in the cult and the bad and the bad at the same time. And really what it is, and this is the same problem with this podcast, is anytime that you're getting so close to a subject that you're getting access to a subject, there's a kind of unwritten agreement for sharing, for getting access to someone like Allison Mack's story. You're making maybe it's unspoken agreement that you'll do your best to present their story in the best light possible. And so once The Vow, first of all, it always started out like it was going to try to argue for the good or the good things in NXIVM. But it also made a deal with Nancy Salzman to be interviewed. And so The Vow Part 2, in my view, is just pretty much, I don't think much of it. It's, they don't ever talk about the fright experiments where they put electrodes on cult members' heads and had them watch the worst things that you can ever think of, imaginable, the most violent things that you can think of imaginable. I mean, they left a lot out. A lot was left on the cutting room floor in The Vow and I believe partially due to the fact that they wanted access with all these key players in this story and key perpetrators.
Told that they're wrong or they're bad. And the most important...
So nobody's ever told they're wrong or they're bad. They're all told, well, Allison Mack said she was immediately pinned as a narcissist and told that she has to get over her own ego. They were all told that they're not victims. I mean, all these statements in the negative should be red flags for everyone. Is exactly what they were doing. They were punished, told they were bad, and NXIVM was one of the most punishing cults.
Thing in working on jeunesse is the relationships in jeunesse. And I'm not used to that. I'm used to the objective being met. I'm used to having like strict, hard, fast deadlines and lots of fear and punishment if I don't get it right. And in working for jeunesse, there isn't any of that. So it comes purely from a place of self-motivation. And
that's exactly what collateral was. Punishments if you don't hold up your end of the bargain. So what collateral? So there's the DOS portion of NXIVM, which is the slave master portion, of which Allison was a master, but she was also a branded slave herself. It's an uncomfortable duality in this story. She would take collateral. One of the things was made up about one of her slaves family members, things that would just absolutely devastate her family. And I remember that victim's family members just weeping through court hearing. Other things, pictures. There's lots of collateral and that Allison Mack collected on people. So there definitely was punishment and fear of punishment used in this. It's just very interesting the way, let's just go back maybe just a tiny little bit, hear her view of it. And the way she's selling it is the exact opposite of what it was.
Deadlines and lots of fear and punishment if I don't get it right. And in working for Jeunesse, there isn't any of that. So it comes purely from a place of self-motivation and self-direction. And that is really difficult. But I would say that working for Jeunesse is the most satisfying and purposeful thing I've ever done. Watching the women who are involved in Jeunesse completely transform and evolve in a way that is so pure is such a privilege. And really literally seeing people's lives path completely turn 180 degrees, where in one moment they really felt like this was all that they had and this was all that they could do, and then all of a sudden they come through Jeunesse and they start working with us and in our community, and it's like a whole nother life is born out of their new experience of themselves. And that's an incredibly satisfying and gratifying thing to do.
She sounds so much like Raniere's gobbledygook here, too.
I think it's challenging because I think Jeunesse is an organization that looks to all participants to be 100% responsible for themselves and their lives. So it makes it hard to blame people for mistakes that are made when you're always looking at your own responsibility and participation in the situation. But that's just hard for my ego and my pride.
Right. They were always telling her any problem. So this is like a very similar thing in all cults. So any problem that you have with the cult leader or the cult is perfect. The cult leader is perfect. Any problem that you have with the cult leader or the cult is somehow some kind of problem with you. And her pride and her ego were obviously things that were identified. She calls it narcissism in the podcast.
I think if the whole world operated in that way, we'd have a much more joyful and a much more efficient existence. The amount of time that we spend blaming one another is a little ridiculous. So working for Jeunesse is grounding and satisfying and humbling and wonderful. Wonderful. This next question is awesome.
So this is very telling too here.
It's, if happiness was the national currency, what would make you rich? And I think the answer to that question is bringing together people that I love the most in order to have a good experience somewhere doing something. I love like putting together dinner parties. I love traveling with people. I love organizing spaces and experiences with the people that I care for the most.
And it's curious. I wonder how many dinner parties she had when she was at NXIVM. She certainly didn't do a lot of traveling when she was in NXIVM. She was mostly in Albany, from what I understand. There wasn't a lot of traveling, but always in a position of power over other people. You know, she's the one organizing things. She's the leader. She wants to be a leader, which brings us finally to her husband. So she's married Frank Mink, who wrote a book called Autobiography of a Recovering Skinhead, which I've read. And it's about his time as a skinhead, who kidnaps a guy, gunpoint, goes to prison, and then gets de-radicalized, and then eventually becomes like a activist for better racial understandings and anti kind of radicalization and hate. I don't know, maybe there's a better way to describe it. But now, so he's gone from being a neo-Nazi to a Jew. And I thought this was just really interesting, this part where he talks about how he how he experiences his Judaism. Let's take a listen.
Started to believe, then I started going to study, and I started reading Torah, and I started rapping tefillin, and it just all started happening. And I'm also in recovery, and I'm very active in my recovery, which is 12 steps, and I'd struggled with that for a long time. And when I started putting this together, the best way I can describe it is, it was like Hashem is like the zipper, but the teeth coming together was like my recovery in Judaism.
So Hashem is God, just so you don't know. Wrapping the tefillin is a kind of ritual done by men in Judaism. You wear a headpiece and you wrap your non-dominant arm while doing prayers.
Perfectly coming together, along with my activism, because my activism is one of the main things in my life. And it just all started to come together. This is where I'm making the full-on conversion over to Judaism. So I'm living on a boat, and the only thing I got to do, because I was living on a boat hiding, was watch videos of like Rabbi Friedman, Rabbi YY, all these guys who just like, that was my main way of learning. When I just moved to a new area, it is hard for me just to walk into a synagogue with tattoos. I always felt weird. You know what I mean? So I had to do everything online. It was during COVID. So I did everything online. I remember I got to talk to one of the rabbis in person. And I said, it was one of the Chabad rabbis brought me to a school to come talk. And I said, well, don't you know, man, like I wasn't raised Jewish. Because I feel that. I'm like, I feel that. So I'm like, I wasn't raised Jewish. I have a bar mitzvah. And he goes, Frank, if you ever feel judged, or if anyone ever judges you for that, tell them to go judge Moses, because he wasn't raised Jewish neither. How about that? It's just little things like that.
That's a good story. So I always like when someone finds something to believe in. But I wonder, I mean, where I wonder is, how, when you accept one really radical ideology, you go on to another and another. And every time, so like when you find your family in skinheads, then you find your family in AA, and then you find your family in Judaism. And it's always like, every kind of development is like the perfect answer, the perfect solution. Are you still asking the necessary skeptical questions? Where does that come in, and do you fear that you'll be brought into something destructive, or that you'll go from kind of one radical ideology to the next without the necessary skepticism? So that is now Allison Mack's husband. And where the podcast doesn't talk about, which I thought was really curious, is her relationship to Judaism. She clearly had a Jewish wedding. And is she a practicing Jew? I would think she would have to be, or not now. Did she convert? That was unclear. But it seems like in this podcast that we're going to be hearing more from Allison Mack, that this is the beginning of her being a really public person. And she talks about, again, I talked about this yesterday, I'll talk about it again. She talks about how she thinks maybe she should just play it small because she won't hurt anybody. But then there's sort of like a pause, like, but I want to do great things. She wants to do big things. And I think there's going to be more documentaries and more of Allison Mack and explaining and trying to explaining herself and trying to revitalize her image and remake her image, and also and rewrite the NXIVM story. What's the most disturbing to me about this story is just one of the things that's most disturbing about this podcast is how it takes everything and tumbles the timing of everything in favor of Allison Mack, that she just had like some kind of grand revelation during Keith Raniere's trial or before Keith Raniere's trial, and had to make some big decision about pleading guilty when they'd all pled out. They'd all pled out very early on into this case. So she saved her. And I think you can't blame her for wanting to save herself and do the best thing for herself. Once Nancy Salzman went down, the number 2 went down and pled out, who was the second most culpable in this story, besides Keith Raniere. So it's Keith Raniere in the middle, Nancy Salzman, and then you could look at maybe Allison Mack and Lauren Salzman as, and Claire Bronfman, all very culpable in this case. But Nancy Salzman could have been doing, and Allison Mack was facing 4 decades in prison and did 21 months. I mean, she got off very easy. And there's a part where she talks about being in prison and getting out of prison. And she's about to be released in like a month or 2. And she's sad that she has to leave prison and face the real world. So I'm not sure exactly, it seems to be a lot of empathy for herself and very little empathy for her victims. Any empathy that she has for her victims immediately goes on herself. Well, I suffered. I did all this. I took the cold showers. I wore this kind of punishing brace around, necklace around my belly that would, called what is it called? A silice? Am I right about that? That had kind of wires that went into my belly if I ate too much. And I was branded and yes, no one's arguing that you weren't a victim of Raniere, but what is your part in what's your part in also all the punishment that you delved out and all the pain that you caused. And the fact that I don't know, she seems to have, and this is something the podcast points out, a blind spot around how she is perceived. She doesn't understand that taking a women's course, that other students might not want her in a women's studies course, or how she thinks she's going to go forward with a degree in social work and having that kind of control over other people's lives. And knowing her background, it may turn to be problematic. That's what I would say. She seems surprised that other students have a bad reaction to her and feel unsafe in her presence, knowing her history. So that's what I have for today, guys. Please hit the thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. Share this episode. Support the channel. Links are in this and every episode. You can buy me a coffee, Venmo, Patreon. Get access to content you won't get anywhere else. I will be back very shortly, always at 6 p.m. with another live stream. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks so much for listening.
Mic check, Roberta strides through the static haze. True crime Gotham where the shadows play their plays. Fraudsters fold when a spotlight beams. Fact focused queen busting propaganda schemes. Glass shatter lies echoes through the streets. Standing for victims, giving voice their beats. NYC Pulse, truth sharp as night. Roberta exposing, she's the anti-fraud light. Hard cash warrior, dissecting state and defense. Twisted innocence, claims breaking pretense. Gotham's truth seeker cuts clean with the blade. Facts in the forefront, no justice gets swayed. Cold facts drip heavy, real talk unfurls. Cracking cases open like oysters with pearls. Innocence gimmicks crumble to dust in the wind. For victims, her creed, justice till the end. Headphones blazing, she She drops heavy artillery, narratives twisted, meet blunt object civility. Roberta got receipts that unravel the ploy, exposing the lies these fraudsters deploy. Glass shatters lies, echoes through the streets, standing for victims, giving voice their beats. NYC Pulse, truth sharp as night. Roberta exposing, she's the anti-fraud light.